We're very lucky to have Ambassador Bilahari Kausikan as our guest today to talk about China in the Middle East. He's had a very distinguished career as a senior or the most senior retired diplomat in the Singapore Foreign Ministry. He was ambassador at large for several years. He was also Singapore's ambassador to the UN. Presently, he's chairman of the Middle East Institute at the National University of Singapore. And so to start off, Ambassador, just a sort of overall question. What is China's role in the Middle East? What's the history been? What's the future look like?
Well, there's been a lot of rather alarmist commentary, alarmist to my mind anyway, about China intruding into the Middle East or words to that effect, right? I think this is misplaced. China was not in the Middle East for the longest time, but China is now becoming a global power, and there's no reason they should not be in the Middle East. There are issues that China will have to confront as it gets more deeply engaged in the Middle East. They have not yet been needed to confront them, but they will. But I think we have to put China's entry into the Middle East in context. For the longest possible time, probably all our lifetimes, the most important external power in the Middle East was the US, right? But the US, what are US interests in the Middle East? For the longest possible time, the core interest was energy supplies for itself, for its friends, for its allies. And therefore, the stability of the Middle East as much as that region can be stable. The US is no longer dependent on Middle East energy. Its friends and allies are still, but that's not exactly the same interest. Furthermore, the US, I think, has finally realized it faces no existential interest, no existential threat in the Middle East. Terrorism, Iran, and the other sponsors of terrorism, they are dangerous, no doubt. But do they threaten in any existential way America or its friends and allies? No, right? No properly ordered state is existentially threatened by terrorists. So there is absolutely no reason for the US to be directly involved in the Middle East as it was after 2003 in Iraq and in Afghanistan. I think those were mistakes because what was the mission? What was the mission? Are you going to destroy terrorism? Terrorism cannot be destroyed. It's somewhere lurking deep in the hearts of human nature. But it's not an existential threat. Just to give you some perspective, we have faced terrorist threats in Singapore and Southeast Asia, and we have destroyed and disrupt the networks. But we still catch a few people here and there, a steady stream, unfortunately, of Singaporeans, including, who think it's a jolly good idea to go off and join Daesh, ISIS. But almost all of them actually, are self-radicalized. So it's not a network, it's not a sanctuary, it's not a state sponsor, it is an ideology. That's a different issue entirely. That's not an issue you can solve by direct intervention, kinetic intervention on the ground. So the US has been correcting its mistake it made in 2003 and in Afghanistan. Every US president since Obama is trying to withdraw from Afghanistan. All have not succeeded until President Biden decided to cut the Gordon knot. It was ugly. It could have perhaps been better executed, but there's no good way to do this, right? And I think it's not a mistake to cut your losses. You did a similar thing 50 years ago in Southeast Asia. You mistook the nature of the threat in Vietnam. You intervened directly. It didn't go well. And you cut your losses and you left. But you didn't leave. And you're not leaving the Middle East. You shifted from direct intervention to being the offshore balancer. And in East Asia, you have been pretty consistent for 50 years. Quite a long time, through many administrations, many changes of administrations as the offshore balancer. And you're still the offshore balancer, a vital role, but a different role from being a direct intervener. And I think something similar is occurring in the Middle East. You are still The Fifth Fleet is still in Bahrain. I don't see any sign of it leaving. The US Air Force is still in the UAE and Qatar. I don't see any sign of leaving. And now and then, when you identify a bad guy that's worth your time, you can reach out from wherever you are and kill him. But that's a different role from intervening on the ground, which I think was a mistake, right? It's the forever war. So the US eventually always does the right thing. As Churchill said, having tried everything else first. And I think you're doing the right thing. Now, China. This is the context of China. China's entry into the Middle East, in the Gulf in particular, only seems unusual or threatening in the context of this reorientation of the US. Not a retreat, but becoming the offshore balancer, right? Why should China not have relations with Saudi Arabia or Qatar or UAE or Iran? It's a major power. It was unusual it didn't have. And China is much more dependent on Middle East energy than the US is anymore. Now, I think China has certain fundamental, very fundamental choices to make. It wants basically its engagement to be fundamentally economic, not security related. But is this viable? Right now, it's in a sweet spot. It has good relations with Israel, with Iran, with Saudi Arabia. Is this sustainable over the long term? I am not so sure. China has some fundamental choices to make, right? And so I don't think we should get too panicked. You are still there. You are fundamentally the security provider for all the Gulf states. You have gone through a rough patch because look, I don't wish to offend anybody, but let me be very blunt. Since the end of the Second World War, frankly, this is the end of the First World War. Let me think. What is the fundamental security posture of all the Gulf states? It is to look for the strongest external power and hug it. Once it was France or Britain, and then it became the US, right? Now, what do you do when the external power is no longer prepared to get automatically directly involved? And there's no other obvious replacement. Is China a replacement? Well, if it abandons Iran, maybe. Will China abandon Iran? And China doesn't want to be the direct security provider. Is Russia? You must be kidding, right? Right? So who? So in the end, it's still the United States, but in a different role, and the Gulf states are not used to this role. We in East Asia, we got used to dealing with you as an offshore balancer 50 years ago. They are still learning how. Now that is the essential meaning of the Abraham Accords. The United States, have decided that Iran is a nasty country, it's a threatening country, but it's not an existential threat. So if you guys think if it's an existential threat, please get together and do something. I'm there at your back, but I'm not going to get involved unless it's worth my while. And it's not going to be worth my while unless you guys get together. That's what's happening in the Middle East. That's the context of China in the Middle East. Nothing to get too alarmed about.
So you mentioned Saudi Arabia, and of course, she recently visited with Mohammed bin Salman. And my impression is the largest importer of Saudi oil is now China. And obviously, that's an incredibly important relationship for both of them. What did you make of the trip?
Well, I make of it that it was a normal trip. If you have a trip from one country to another country which is very important economically to each other, what's unusual about that? I don't think we should read more or less into it than just that.
And China's close allies are Pakistan, North Korea. It's not a bunch of alliances that are particularly with wonderful partners. And how do you assess Belt and Road? It seems like the shine has come off Belt and Road a bit in terms of people understand that you can pay a pretty big price. These loans are pretty high rates. Has have views of the Belt and Road initiatives sort of shifted in the recent years?
Look, I'm you're probably asking the wrong person, because I am one of those who was always very skeptical of the Belt and Road in the first place. I saw it as a collection of projects wrapped up in a slogan presented as a strategy. But it's still a collection of projects. Some projects were just not viable. Some were taken for non-commercial reasons. That's true. For example, Gwadar Port in Pakistan.
Yeah.
But there has been a sifting out on the Chinese side as well as on the recipient side because of these projects to scale down some, to abandon some, because the Chinese cannot just subsidize unviable projects forever. They've got huge problems at home that requires a lot of resources. And so again, the Belt and Road Initiative is a grand vision, but vision is vision. Vision is not strategy, and not all visions come to pass. So I think we are seeing a sobering down of everybody on the Chinese side as well as the recipient side of what the Belt and Road means.
You mentioned these problems at home. How do that affect Chinese foreign policy?
Well, in the last few years, I think China has relied more and more on a nationalist narrative to justify Communist Party rule. Problems at home, I hope they solve them because, China's economy is an integral part of the world economy, and I don't think it will bifurcate into two separate systems. But I think they're going to face some years of slower growth. And therefore, to legitimize its rule, the Chinese Communist Party may, I'm not sure, right, may rely more on this nationalist narrative, which may lead to more assertive behavior around the world, at least in parts of the world, not everywhere in the world. It's too early to tell. We saw that a few years ago with the Wolf Warriors.
Yeah.
Remember them?
Yeah.
Right? They've gone a little quiet. They've been muzzled and leashed for the time being, but they could be unleashed again. It depends on what happens at home. They have got huge problems of economic development. Don't forget, the Chinese Communist Party is still a Leninist party that claims a monopoly of power over all aspects of state and society. But I don't think there's anybody in China who really believes in class struggle anymore. You probably got more people in Western universities who believe in class struggle than in China, all right? So they depend on this nationalist narrative. But the nationalist narrative rests on a foundation of economic growth. And if your economic growth slows, you will have to depend more on nationalist narratives. And that could lead to very assertive, if not aggressive behavior. I don't think in the Middle East particularly, but in other parts of the world.
Well, the other part, which obviously is of concern, is Taiwan. So what were the lessons of Ukraine for the Chinese leadership?
Well, that's the million-dollar question to which I don't have any answer. I know what I hope the lesson is, and I know what most people hope the lesson is, but I'm not sure that is the lesson. Look, what did Putin and Xi Jinping have in common? A huge distrust for the West, coupled with a huge contempt for the West. You are effete, you are ineffectual, you are in absolute decline, right? Now, I hope the unexpectedly, I have to say unexpectedly, resolute, swift Western response to Ukraine, and I think we all should all owe Mr. Putin a vote of thanks for revitalizing the idea of the West and the transatlantic alliance, right? Didn't mean it, of course, but he did, right? I hope that has given both of them some cause to reevaluate what they think of the West. I'm not sure. Yeah. I think they will at least wait until the 2024 presidential elections. I think they both still hope that Europe will break, but I hope they take the right lesson. Now, Taiwan is another issue. I don't think it's the same issue as Ukraine at all, by the way.
Do the Chinese care who wins the US presidential election in 2024?
Well, they hope it's somebody like Mr. Trump who did damage the US image, if not soft power. I don't like the term soft power. I'll use it for one of a better term, around the world. I think Mr. Putin is certainly hoping for some, not Mr. Trump, some Trump-like figure to emerge. The Chinese probably are more cautious because they were burnt by Mr. Trump too. Huh? But let's not forget that.
Yeah.
There's a difference there between China and Russia. But, you know, I come back to your earlier point. Look around the world. China is not in a great geopolitical position as far as people it can rely on. Right? North Korea, Pakistan, indeed Russia. Are these assets or liabilities? Not so easy to tell, right? I personally tend to think they are more liabilities than assets.
Let me ask you, Ambassador, I'll also use the term soft power. Understanding is a little fuzzy as a term, but I mean, when you look at polling data about China now, it seems that China is not sort of widely admired. Maybe the zero COVID policy, maybe the treatment of the Uyghurs, there may be a whole series of things. Do you think it's true that China's sort of position in the world has weakened in terms of just people's views of it? And B, why do you think it's happened?
All right, look, China is a geopolitical fact. China's re-emergence as a major global power is a geopolitical fact, whether you like it or not. So nobody is ever going to shun China. Everybody is going to have to deal with China.
Yeah.
But I think what is remarkable over the last 10, 15 years is the change in international perceptions of China. If you cast your mind back to 2008, the time of the Summer Olympics in Beijing, China was riding high throughout the world. There were some concerns about Tibet's human rights here and there, but by and large, its image was very high. Right? Right now, I cannot think of any country, including some very dependent on China, like Pakistan, that do not have some concerns about some aspect or another of Chinese behavior. Now, this is kind of a major foreign policy failure. This can't happen by accident, right? Why did it happen? I think there are two fundamental reasons. One, the premature abandonment of Deng Xiaoping's wise policy of hiding your capabilities and biding your time. In other words, you thought you arrived before you really arrived. And secondly, believing your own propaganda about your rise being, some kind of supernatural superpower, and the West being in absolute decline. The West meaning, in particular, the United States. Look, there is, of course, relative adjustments of power, because if China rises, the relative position of the US is not the same as before, right? That's obvious, But believing your own propaganda that, the US is in absolute decline was a fundamental mistake. And if you expose your ambitions prematurely, it's very hard to hide them again, But don't mistake me. China is a geopolitical fact. Everybody has to deal with it. Nobody's going to shun China, but I can't think of any country, big or small, that does not have some degree of concerns about Chinese behavior. Mind you, all of us have some concerns about American behavior too, but that's another issue.
Yeah, I'm sitting in Washington, and there's very few things people agree about in Washington, but China seems to be one of the
concerns.
Yeah. So, I mean, look at the Trump national security strategy. Look at Biden's kept the tariffs.
More or less the same.
It's more or less the same. What do you make of that?
I think it's more or less the same because you are responding to a change in the strategic environment. And that change is the rise of China and a certain type of Chinese behavior. It's not rocket science. Look, Trump administration was often accused of being erratic, not having a strategy. But now the documents that we have seen, say the Indo-Pacific framework papers, right? They are essentially the same. So it's not that the Trump administration had no strategy, it's that Mr. Trump didn't implement his own strategy, even if he read it. Okay. All right. So I think you are responding. There's a consistency because you are responding to a change in strategic environment, and there is a limited range of responses to those changes.
You're familiar with the Thucydides trap, the idea that,
I think it's a silly idea.
Okay, why? And just in the context, just for the listeners, viewers don't, the idea that a rising power will eventually challenge a dominant power, with certain exceptions, like the British didn't challenge the United States, and the United States didn't challenge Britain. So, but why is it a silly idea?
I think it's a silly idea because it's far too mechanical.
Yeah.
As a slight aside, it is my grievance against international relations theory in general is far too mechanical, right? I'm not a great fan, by the way. Look, and also if you know there's a trap, right, you must be really stupid to walk into it, right? And now that a very learned professor, who I greatly respect, actually, otherwise from this book of his, has exposed the trap for everybody, you got to be really obtuse to walk into it. But more fundamentally, there's this little matter called nuclear deterrence. Right? Nuclear deterrence kept the peace between the United States and the Soviet Union for 40 years. I think by and large, it will keep the peace between the US and China, because neither of you are irrational countries, and it will be irrational to go against the logic of nuclear deterrence. Now, that does not mean accidents cannot happen. It does not mean that small incidents cannot get out of hand. But I think that to consider this trap, which has a rather mechanical quality to it, is not how the world works.
You mentioned nuclear powers, and Iran, just to get back to the Middle East, and now has enough fissile material for several weapons, according to inspectors. If you could reflect on the Chinese influence on Iran, relationship with Iran, what this this pile of fissile material might mean in terms of a nuclear arms race in the Middle East, and how that links with China.
Okay, look, I have a very pessimistic view of the situation in the Middle East. I think sooner or later, there is going to be a major war in the Middle East to stop Iran becoming a nuclear power. I'm not saying anybody, neither Israel nor Saudi nor anybody, nor Iran, is eager to fight a big war, but the trajectory they are on is leading that direction. It's not going to happen next week, nor even next year, or maybe not even the next 5 years or 10 years, but this trajectory is leading in that direction. Now, that poses certain fundamental challenges to China. I said at the beginning, China now is in a kind of sweet spot because he has good relations with Israel, good relations with Saudi Arabia, good relations with Iran. This cannot last. It has to make some fundamental choices, sooner or later, right? Now, can China stop Iran from acquiring a nuclear capability? I don't think so. China couldn't stop North Korea. Why can it stop Iran? And one of the casualties, by the way, of the Ukraine war is the non-proliferation regime, insofar as it was alive, right? So I think my long-term trajectory for on this issue is a rather pessimistic one, a bleak one. I really hope I'm wrong, but I don't think I'm wrong.
Yeah. And if Iran seemed to have a nuclear weapon, presumably the Saudis could get the Pakistanis to help them get an off-the-shelf nuclear capability.
Who paid for the Pakistani nuclear program? I don't think the Pakistan had the money.
Yeah.
I think the Saudis basically have taken a put option on a Pakistani bomb.
Yeah.
I don't know. I have no evidence, by the way, but this is my logic leads me to this conclusion, rather bleak conclusion.
China's relationship with Qatar, since we're here in at the Doha Forum, how would you characterize that?
It's good. Qatar is a major energy supplier. So why should they not have a good relationship?
Yeah. Same
I
with you.
don't see anything. I don't see anything fundamentally unusual about either Gulf states cultivating relations with China or China cultivating relations with Gulf states. Right? That's what diplomacy is about. Most of the time, not all the time, but that's what it's about.
And in the last minute or so that we have before we wrap up, how just to sort of return to the you said at the beginning something interesting, which is in a way none of this is surprising that China is kind of pretty involved in the Middle East for a long period when China really was a non-player in the Middle East. Yeah. So what China was a non-player in the Middle East because it was so distracted by the Cultural Revolution and these. Why was China?
Not because it didn't have the capability.
Yeah.
Right. It's simple as that. China was a rather weak power until relatively recently. Right. It's now becoming a global power. I think China will eventually deploy military assets, naval assets at least, although it doesn't want to be the security provider in the Middle East. Why? Because right now, the Middle East is a major energy supplier to China. And who is protecting those energy routes? The Fifth Fleet and Seventh Fleet. This is not sustainable for any major power, right? So they will have to, nothing unusual, right? But that will bring them up against who? Who is the major disruptor of this, potential disruptor of these energy routes? Who? Iran. So there are some fundamental choices China has to make.
The Middle East is full of various wars which proxy forces are engaged. So, in Yemen, we have Iran and at one point UAE and to some extent still the Saudis. And in Libya, we have multiple players like the Russians and the Turks and others. Why do you think Chinese have not engaged in proxy warfare in the Middle East?
Because they are not daft. Because they are not daft.
Okay.
But, whether they can stay sober and sane, given the nature of the Middle East, remains to be seen.
But it's interesting they don't really engage in proxy warfare anywhere, given the fact that they have the resources clearly, but they just have chosen not to do it.
Ask the Myanmar people who has been supporting those ethnic armed insurgencies since time immemorial.
Okay.
They may be a bit more clever about how they do it. They leave less fingerprints, but they are not angels either.
A question on Singapore, because I've often talked about balancing. My impression, I visited Singapore shortly after 9/11 and have been back many times since. And it seems that the attitude towards China in Singapore has sort of shifted over time. There was a period when there was really just a balancing act between China and the United States. It seems that Singapore has sort of really made a bet on the United States in a way that wouldn't have been true 20 years ago. Is that right or not?
No, we have, from the minute of our independence, even before independence, we have said consistently and publicly that there can be no strategic balance in Southeast Asia or East Asia without the United States. And small countries like us need a strategic balance. That is even more true today because China has risen and there's no strategic balance against China without the United States. That does not mean we are taking sides. It means we are following our own interests. Some of our interests may take us in the direction of the United States. Our security interests certainly do. Some of our other interests may take us in the direction of China. Some of our other interests may take us in the direction of Japan or Botswana, for that matter. But they are always our interests and nobody else. That is our consistent position. And actually, it is the position of almost all Southeast Asian countries.
You've written about Chinese influence operations in Australia and New Zealand. Obviously, it's a big political question in Australia. Do the Chinese have these kinds of influence operations in the Middle East?
I don't know because I really haven't looked in the Middle East. I doubt they will have the same kind of resonance because they are mainly focused on ethnic Chinese. There aren't too many in the Middle East, right? But I think there are two types of influence operations. One are very targeted to achieve a certain specific objective, change your position on, say, South China Sea or or something like that, right? And there's what I call there's what I call the ambient influence operations. Oh, the Ukraine war is not Russia being aggressive against a smaller country. It's all NATO's fault or somebody else's fault. That's the kind of ambient kind of thing. I think that's going on in the Middle East as everywhere else. But I'm not sure that there are these targeted ones, to achieve specific objectives. Now, influence operations is a big term. We are already talking about covert influence operations, right? I have been an agent of influence of the Singapore government all my working life, also known as a diplomat, right? And you have been, everybody has been, right? But that's not what you're talking about. Now, I don't know enough about what Chinese are doing in this sphere in the Middle East, but certainly they are going to be influential because they are a big power. Doesn't mean that the US is going to be any less influential, because I said the US has performed certain functions China cannot.
In the very short time we have left, just a quick thought. We're in the 20th anniversary moment of the US invasion of Iraq. Russian Minister Lavrov has recently sort of brought this issue up when he was in India, and in the sort of global South, there's a kind of rather different view of the Putin's invasion of Ukraine because it's sort of bracketed with the US invasion of Iraq. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, to some degree. Look, if you look at it in abstract principle, what's different, right? I'll tell you what's different. And I'll be very blunt. I don't mean to offend anybody. Ukraine, the kind of conflict, has been a constant reality in the Middle East, in Africa, in some parts of Asia, since forever. Ukraine is only unique because it's in the heart of Europe, or to put it very bluntly, for a change, white people are killing other white people with the support of other white people, instead of white people killing brown or black people, or brown or black people killing each other with the encouragement of white people. And that really is why your support for the Ukraine war in the global South is rather more tenuous than many people in the West believe.
Well, thank
and
you.
this is going to be important because it's going to be a long war.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for all your generosity of time and your insights, and thank you very much.
Good night.